If you can't say anything good, say nothing at all, my mum used to say, usually as I was complaining about my big brother's behaviour. Trying to get her to listen was sometimes a very frustrating experience. Silence, it seemed, really was golden, or at least convenient. I want it to be so quiet that I can hear a pin drop, said the class lunch monitors, big bossy kids, tasked with keeping the rest of us in check during rainy breaks and lunchtimes at school. On our way to assembly, the teachers would make us press our fingers over our lips, so only the sound of us padding to the hallway in our indoor pumps could be heard. The local vicar, a puzzling and slightly terrifying man, who visited the school occasionally for lessons and assemblies, stood in front of the class every year at Lent to tell us that Jesus was silent in the face of his accusers. He'd tell us that silence can be more eloquent than a speech and louder than a shout. I was as bewildered as my classmates. He'd drawn the passage from chapter 27 of the Gospel of Matthew, when, after he'd been betrayed in Gethsemane, arrested and taken to the high priest, Jesus had been brought before Pilate. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he answered him not one word, so that the governor marvelled greatly. I was confused by the silence of Jesus. Why didn't he speak out? It even seemed that Pilate might be trying to help him establish his innocence. Of course, various interpretations have read this silence as Jesus' way of wresting power back from Pilate, as his refusal to allow Pilate to name him or define his mission. But that would have been lost on me and my classmates in school assemblies. The message I got from the vicar was clear to me. Silence was strength, and silence, especially in the face of adversity and abuse, was dignified. As a child then, I learned that silence was prized and praised. Jesus was the ultimate example of silence as a virtue. It's not just the writer of Matthew's Gospel who presents this model of silent suffering. Christians down the ages have interpreted the words of the prophet Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible as a foreshadowing of the silent passion of Jesus. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearer was silent, so he did not open his mouth. I wasn't the only one among the pupils of that school in South Yorkshire for whom silence became a kind of default behaviour. When I was 10, I went shopping in town with 3 of my aunties. I was a big fan of Nancy Drew books at the time, and I'd collected almost all of the Case Files sub-series, which I lined up in order just underneath my posters of Bros. I was missing the final instalment and I was desperate to complete my collection. My aunts took me to a bookstore and waited outside, while, almost giddy with excitement, I searched for that final elusive book. While I was looking through the paperbacks, a man approached me. He looked me up and down, and I remember feeling suddenly awkward and foolish in my own body. I'd worn my favourite lime green t-shirt and shorts set. It was covered in a tropical fruit print. I'd wanted to be stylish for the shopping trip, and this, I felt, channeled just the right amount of Bananarama. Now, though, I felt embarrassed by this outfit that had drawn the attention of this man. I felt uncomfortable under his stare. I focused on Nancy Drew. He came closer and said something about Anne of Green Gables. He was going to buy it for me. He kept touching the front of his trousers, and it made me feel sick. Then I saw the book that I'd been searching for. I made a grab for it, just as the man grabbed my hand and asked me to do something to him. I didn't understand. I had no idea what he'd asked me to do, but I didn't like where he'd put my hand, and I didn't like his insistent, hot breath so close to my face. My 10-year-old brain took a few seconds to realise that I'd have to sacrifice Nancy Drew. Crying with the disappointment of having to leave my book behind and the embarrassment at the strange behaviour of the man, I shook my hand free and rushed out of the shop to find my aunts. He shouted after me as I ran off. In the early 90s, when I reached comprehensive school in Rotherham, the power of silence was confirmed. I was 11 when I started my first year, and I quickly learned that girls' bodies didn't belong to them. We didn't have full ownership. Boys could touch, prod and grab, and many of them did. Having a hand up your skirt or a painful pinch to the chest was an everyday occurrence for the girls at my school. It was annoying, embarrassing, often humiliating and painful, but nothing could be said that would prevent it. Some of the teachers weren't aware, and some that were appeared to have little desire to stop it happening. No kind of response from girls bold enough to challenge it seemed to make a difference, so we just accepted it as part of school life, like getting homework. It was the way things go. In fact, the girls who showed that they were upset by it and cried about it were the ones who were despised, even by other girls. Stoic silence made the everyday easier, and it prevented you from attracting even more attention or worse treatment. In a context where silence is promoted as a virtue and girls' bodies are open for comment, discussion and assault, it's not difficult to see how towns like Rotherham could become places where the systematic sexual abuse of girls and women became widespread. We didn't realise it was abuse. No one ever referred to it as such. A good number of girls at school had adult male boyfriends in their 20s. They'd often discuss them in class, even in front of teachers. I got no sense that there was anything criminal. Often, there wasn't much more than a sense of disapproval, and that was directed more at the girls themselves than at the men. So, I became as accustomed to the silence of adults in authority as I was to the silence of children. We now know, of course, that many girls and women who experienced sexual abuse in Rotherham, Rochdale, and all the other now infamous towns across the country did report their abusers. But the authorities at the time didn't listen. Many girls were vocal about their situations. They just weren't taken seriously and no one cared to hear them. Some of those who gave voice to their abuse were arrested themselves and punished for speaking out. Silence was often safer than saying anything. A number of my friends were abused by men in their 20s. A gang of local white men would hang around at ice rinks to meet and groom girls for sex. And to me, and no doubt to my friends too, they were the loveliest, funniest people I'd ever met. They weren't like the immature, spotty lads at school, grabbing at our bodies and spitting insults. Instead, they complimented us, they stroked our hair, and they held our hands. After a couple of meetings at the ice rink, they invited us to a party, and we all went. Not a word to our parents. After all, silence is golden, and we were excited to spend time with these seemingly kind, funny and romantic men. But as soon as we turned up, I could tell that the party had a very different feel to our earlier meetings. A couple of older lads, aged 15 or 16, ran in. They were laughing about how they'd just punched an old man in the face on the way down to the party. His nose had exploded, and they reenacted the moment. I remember feeling lightheaded at that second, and their voices seemed far, far away, like I might faint. I felt a sense of dread so strong that I thought I might throw up. My friends and I were given drinks, and the men watched us while we downed them. I couldn't drink mine. I kept thinking of my dad and my throat wouldn't work. My friends were quickly out of it. A couple of them had passed out. I still couldn't drink, even when they tried to force me. And so I escaped the worst of that party. I was really lucky. While my friends were being raped, I was held down. And while one of the men rubbed newspaper in my face with one hand, he broke my arm with the other. I kept silent. As a very clumsy child who frequently fell and broke bones, my broken arm was easily explained away as the result of an accident on the ice rink. No one batted an eyelid. My friends and I never talked about it again after that night. I couldn't even look them in the eye. The fear and sickness and humiliation that I felt that night wedged in my throat and remained there for years. It didn't even occur to us to tell an adult what had happened. We knew that we'd be blamed. What did you think would happen if you hung around with men? You were asking for trouble. The prospect of telling an adult in authority seemed so much worse than dealing with the constant sense of dread on my own. I felt very strongly, in fact more than that I knew, that speaking out would make my situation much worse. Silence felt safe. In the end, I think, it turns out that my instincts were spot on. How many girls and women did speak out about their abuse and weren't believed, or were half believed and then blamed and punished for it? I thought of the local vicar's words a lot in that time. Jesus' silence has always troubled me. It's both comforting and disquieting. I found it comforting because even Jesus, my childhood model of virtue, had no words in the face of impending violence. But disquieting too. What kind of model is a silent Jesus, really, for those experiencing abuse and receiving scant support from authority figures? In our post-Rotherham, post-Weinstein era, it seems that, through movements like #MeToo, we've finally understood the dangers of silence and the power of speaking out. Yet victims of sexual abuse are still being condemned for their silence. During the Weinstein scandal, women who spoke up about their abuse were heavily criticised for remaining silent, as if their silence made them complicit in their own or others' abuse. Because when it comes down to it, we've still got so far to go. As the Rotherham and Weinstein abuse scandals have shown all too well, we're still eager to blame victims for their abuse, and we're still eager to explain abuse away. After all, we don't have to make any serious changes to our thinking and our behaviour if the blame lies with the victims. The local vicar never told us about the vocal Jesus in John's Gospel, the one who speaks out and speaks up, who speaks up about speaking out. When John's Jesus is arrested and questioned by the high priest, he says, "I've always spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple. I have nothing in secret. Why do you ask me what I said? Ask those who have heard what I said to them. They know what I said." He's slapped across his face for his pains, and then he says, "If I've spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I've spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Likewise, before Pilate, Jesus engages in feisty debate. He questions, he answers, and he says, "I came into the world to testify to the truth, and everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Of course, John's Jesus is still condemned and crucified by the authorities. His speaking out doesn't stop them from torturing and killing him. But what if the school vicar had given me John's model of Jesus? What if I'd been told that there's strength and dignity in speaking out rather than in staying silent? What if I'd been taught to be confident in my own voice? It didn't change what happened to John's Jesus, but maybe it might have changed what happened to me and what happened to some of the other kids in South Yorkshire.